Okay, our panellists. If I can just get our panellists to start making their way onto the stage while I introduce how incredible they are. So leading us towards the end of the day, our second panel is on funding and financing the future. And yes, there is a difference, as we've been finding out, between these two mechanisms. Now, we want to explore how we might overcome the current barriers to investment in and funding for climate adaptation. If we know and acknowledge that the costs, as we've been unpacking, of climate change include environmental, human, social, cultural, as well as more concrete infrastructure or financial costs, what innovative solutions are there to respond equitably and effectively? So in this panel, we bring together possibilities and provocations that interrogate government policy levers, alternative business strategies, and private sector mobilisation. Now, we're very lucky to have these four powerhouses on the stage with us today, and I will introduce them very briefly, but as I've said, there's more robust bios on our webpage. I'll start with Riria. Riria Te Kanawa is a partner at KPMG, where she works with clients to realise their aspirations, or Māori clients in particular, in the pursuit of the perfect balance between people, planet, and pūtea. No mai Riria. John Reid is a problem solver of the first degree, a specialist in Indigenous economic development, and John leads multiple national research programs that bring together science, industry and Indigenous communities to address sustainability for our oceans, freshwater, land and biodiversity. Goodness me, no mai John, kia ora. Joe Kelly is Chief Executive of Toitū Tāpua, the Centre for Sustainable Finance, both supporting and driving business to make significant transformations in the way that they operate. And David Hall is Climate Policy Director at Toha, which we think is proving to be a bit of a game changer. His report from 2022, Adaptation, Finance, Risks and Opportunities for Aotearoa, New Zealand, has done some pretty amazing things. Anyway, you guys are all amazing, and it's an honour and a privilege to have you here. So let's get started. Is the lapel on, bro? Me. Okay, come on. Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. Oh, are we all good? Are all of our masks on? Okay, so like I said before, some pretty hearty issues that we touched on in the tables have really gone in to unpack these. I want to start with you, David. Could you please characterise the current landscape of climate adaptation funding and financing, yeah?
Inadequate, in a word. Very inadequate in 2 words, I'd say. Yeah, I mean, there's 2 streams to it. There's the money that we're already spending and whether that is aligned towards climate adaptation. So the budget yesterday announced 71 billion in infrastructure investment over 5 years, about 14 billion a year. And there's a question, is that going towards infrastructure which is resilient or unresilient in itself, whether it's exposed to climate impacts or not, whether it is going to improve adaptation in the surrounding area, or whether this infrastructure is itself maladaptive. Elan talked earlier about stock banks in Westport as a possible, as an example, and I've done analysis on the COVID spending, and as well, a lot of that went into maladaptive infrastructure as well. And even on the radio yesterday morning, there was a report from Waka Kotahi that they'd basically done no resilience planning in any of the investment, and it was something that they were shifting towards. So that's the first part of it, is we need to make sure what we are already spending is going to the right place. And then the second part of it is that there's a lot more new spending we need to do on top of that. The infrastructure deficit is been estimated at about 210 billion, so that's 3 times more than what's mentioned in the budget. And there's other expenditure we need to do as well. We need to put money into R&D for adaptive technologies like drought-resistant crops or precision irrigation. We also need money in repairing the whenua. I'm working a bit out on the East Coast at the moment, and there's these questions: how do we restore ngahere to some of those upper catchments in order to make them more resilient to the climate impacts that we've been seeing? How do we also restore wetlands in the lower catchments and riparian margins and so on to enhance the resilience of those catchments? And so, government needs to fund a lot of that because a lot of it is public goods, but government can't fund all of it, and that probably shouldn't fund all of it either, because businesses and so on have a responsibility, I think, to pay for some of that as well, whether that's for investing in their own risk management through their value chains and supply chains, in line with what Mark Baker-Jones was talking about, and responding to their climate risk management. And some businesses have also been involved in maladaptive practices, and they should probably be paying to clean up some of the messes that they've made. And that's certainly something which came out of the land use inquiry, where the forestry companies should be paying for some of the repair that is needed out there. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, you've already kind of addressed a follow-up question on that of, what are the barriers in terms of, investing and funding climate adaptation for the government in particular. But what are some of the other innovative, especially when it comes to inequities, what are the other innovative ways in which we can overcome those particular barriers of how adaptation is funded?
Yeah, innovation can play a role, but a lot of it is just targeting what we already spend and what we could spend in better ways. And especially, I think, when it comes to public funding, the priority should be for our most disadvantaged communities and those who are going to benefit most from that infrastructure, and who don't have recourse to other sorts of risk management, like risk transfer through insurance, or investing in the assets that they have and enhancing that resilience. That sort of investment is not available, and access to finance is not available to many communities to the same extent as others. And so, where public money is best spent is exactly to those communities. But it doesn't need to be innovative, and it can be through a number of existing policy tools, even in the social policy space. I mean, we make a mistake if we think that everything needs to be labelled specifically as adaptation. A lot of different sorts of policy, including social policy, can enhance the resilience of communities.
Riria, I'll just come to you. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, Aloha mai whānau, technical difficulties. Are we good now? Sorry, just as I was saying, just coming to you, Riria, on that, drawing from your particular experiences around, Indigenous investing and decision making, what insights can you give us for the funding and financing climate adaptation with, and some of the key challenges that your clients are facing in the area?
Tuatahi me mihi ai kia te Aotearoa, nā rātou te whenua nei. Tuarua i ngā maunga i ngā awa, i ngā moana ki roto i tēnei ruma, tēnā koutou katoa. I think there's more challenges to conquer than there are sort of examples and solutions out there, but that's the beauty, that we can enter into that discovery space. I think when I come back to us, our values are really well matched to this particular challenge, and specifically like our intergenerational view, our connectedness and understanding the connection between the different pieces. We don't operate in silos. And the third one is we understand the importance of balancing off this sort of financial piece with, everything else. And, we always label social, environmental, economic. I don't like it, but I don't have another version. Having that values base is awesome, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those decisions are any easier for us, because we've got to remember that our decision makers have come through a system, and some of them have been conditioned by a system, which is the system that has generated this problem in the first place. So if we've got to sort of go back to the mind shift, which is the hardest thing to do. You can pay for things, you can improve a process or a system, but actually the way we think about it determines how that system is shaped in the first place. So those power brokers, that's where we really need to focus on first of all. In some of those discussions, a lot of it's around the framing. So if we talk about whether it's adaptation or anything else, it's sort of, it's a cost. But if we reframe it from being a cost to being the protection of revenue, so sort of staying in this businessy realm, you know, whether it's revenue protection, whether it's the cost versus us existing forever, whether it's a cost and saying actually this is about our social license to carry on as well. There's a reframing to go on beyond the cost piece. I think one of the challenges, and this sort of plays into, I guess, the inertia that we might experience, and that is robust long-term data that is consistent over a wide area, and people always go back to, but we haven't got the data, we haven't got the data. And that's where your true leadership has to come through, because any decision that leaders make these days, it's not perfect, it is imperfect, but we still kind of find times to go, oh, we haven't got the data to justify not moving or not taking that perceived risk. And then if I come back to sort of that Māori value set, you kind of go, that I think those are what we need embedded in a system. But if you look at the financial system, it's not necessarily one that is well placed to value or understand those values, value or understand the mindset. And so they could well be missing out on a significant opportunity to bring different views and thoughts to this particular challenge ahead of us. And there could be some real gold in there, but you've got to open up to it, and not to Māori just being participants in the conversation. They actually have to lead it, because they've got to show people where to go. You can't tell someone who doesn't know where to go to take you there. So I think we've got to rebalance this decision-making seat place. It's not about being at the table, it's about leading the table and showing them where it is. And then, you know, I need to finish up and draw on a decent example. So you've got an outfit like Tahito, so Māori-led investment fund. And so you have a look at their portfolio and you won't find fossil fuels in there. So they're making those values-based decisions, and their performance is doing better than the benchmark that they line up against. So I think we just probably have to amplify some of the good opportunities, or examples, that are out there.
For sure. That brings me to you, John, about, you know, what can we learn from like that particular example from Māori investment and the economic practices to support us in this particular space, because your work directly relates to these particular apartheid. And could you just talk us through a bit of your research and how it does bear on climate adaptation?
So I think I'll start by talking a little bit about what's happening in the farming sector, and then related to Māori after that. But so, of course, the farming sector is probably one of New Zealand's areas of where they're most exposed in terms of climate change adaptation. It's also the area that most affects us from the extreme events from climate change. For example, flooding, drought, these sort of issues. So flooding from, upper catchments being denuded over time. And so the farming sector is pretty central to New Zealand's adaptation, that alongside the transport sector are sort of key areas. But what you're seeing is, despite quite a lot of negative media attention, a lot of positive things happening in the farming sector, with groups and networks of regenerative farmers working together to explore alternative pathways and ways of operating. And where that's being led principally is amongst Māori. Māori farming entities are leading a lot of this, a lot of the science and investigation into this area. And what you have happening is things like with regenerative farming, where they're using diverse pasture species and so on, where carbon's being sequestered into soil, very low levels of nutrients needing to be placed on pasture at the same time, and therefore carbon footprints falling for those farms, sequestering more carbon, also on-farm restoration of wetlands and of forest areas and riparian planting. So you're getting a vision starting to form within parts of that farming sector of how the entire agricultural sector can transform. And we're seeing that, for example, Ngāi Tahu converting a large portion of Ngāi Tahu farms to regenerative farming methods. Also doing landscape scale planning amongst iwi, working with scientists on that front to see what's happening, anticipating what's going to happen with future extreme events, flooding and drought extremities, and how we can reshape landscapes by having mountains to the sea corridors of forests integrated with wetlands and estuarines and duneland areas. So it's almost like a full-scale approach where you're starting to reconstruct the landscape to enable us to be able to adapt to climate change in terms of the effects on communities and built environment, but also how you can also generate all these reciprocal benefits from it. And as part of that, we're seeing at the same time internationally financial capital wanting to head in directions where it can support this type of work to happen. And one of the biggest issues we face is not having really good data and information of being able to say, we've planted this here, or we've restored a wetland here, and this is what the effects of that is. This is how much carbon it sequesters, or this is how much, and this is the impact it's having on society, the positive impact. So that's the other area from my end too, is exploring the environmental monitoring side. So hopefully that gives you...
Incredible.
Yeah.
And can you speak more to that around the taututu?
So taututu is a Māori principle, and it used to underpin Māori trade. So it's based on the idea of the idea of sharing. So if you're sharing something with someone else, there is sort of an expectation in time something will be shared back with you, but potentially with a little bit more than you gave initially. So this idea of it binds communities together through the process of gifting and return. But the same thing not only applies between relationships between people and between communities and societies or countries, the same thing also applies with the relationship to the whenua, or if you're investing in the land, caring for it in that sense, something comes back to you in a cycle, in a reciprocal cycle. So that's kind of the underpinning philosophy and thinking that not only runs through economics, but also through environmental human relationships.
Yeah, and when we're talking about obviously cost and financing, those sorts of things, your sustainable finance is obviously a very key component in a society where nature and communities thrive, as an example of what John's just outlined as well. So Jo, what is sustainable finance more generally, and how can it become more prevalent, and how do you think in terms of the space of climate adaptation does that, or how that can improve?
Yeah, sure.
Oh.
Hold on. I'll just do what you do.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Can you hear me? Is that better?
Go.
Is that better?
That's better. Yeah.
I'll just talk like this. I guess to start with, maybe it's useful to talk about finance before you put the sustainable part on the front. And this can get quite philosophical, but
Go.
finance is an enabler for things to happen in the real economy, right? And so there are sort of lots of ways of thinking about the role of money or the role of capital in society, and one of them, there is a school of thought, is that, to your point about kind of exchange, it's really just a source of energy that can be utilised to realise potential, be that sort of individual or societal potential. That's one school of thought. There are others, of course. In terms of sustainable finance, so this sort of exists at multiple levels. Internationally, sustainable finance tends to be defined as a process of considering environmental, social, or governance factors into financial decision making. It aims specifically, though, to promote sustainable economic development, has a bit of a bent toward growth. So, there's another conversation that I'm sure there are people in the room around degrowth. But it also aims to promote long-term financial system resilience and stability, and it covers all types of activities from, lending to investment to insurance. So ESG is the thing that we usually hear about, that most people are familiar with. You can think of ESG as the factors that are being considered in sustainable finance. And then more recently, we've become much more comfortable and familiar with the language of transition. So now we start to talk about transition finance, which is again kind of a subset of essentially providing finance to help companies move from less to more sustainable models. So I think, what was the second part of the question? How
Just
can
keep
we?
going, you're on a roll, mate.
Yeah. I guess I should talk about the centre's perspective on all of this. So the Centre for Sustainable Finance is only 18 months old, but our purpose is to accelerate a financial system by 2030, so we're time bound, that is more equitable, inclusive and sustainable. And so that covers off, we have a roadmap, it covers off many, many different facets of the system, which are things like prudential regulation and definitions and disclosures and directors' duties. And so we sort of we don't sit back, but we take a view of the whole system as opposed to just the development of a marketplace for sustainable finance products. Yeah.
Whoa, okay. But just sorry, I'll just stay with you, Jo, for a little bit, because I did want to talk about your other kind of pūtea that you wear. So you're the director of B Lab. We just want to get all these Bs right.
Yeah,
so that's what I'm going to read. So you're the director of B Lab Australia and New Zealand, which is the non-profit network that certifies and supports the movement of B Corps globally. Okay. Yeah. So not to be confused with the B Team, obviously, which was the global leadership organisation that you did help establish back in 2011. Yeah. Lots of Bs. So many Bs. Need some, I don't know, maybe some like brand identity reviews. No.
Yeah, there is no plan B, actually. We all know that by now.
So the B Corps, or businesses that have achieved B Corp certification, are some of the leaders in redefining our culture of accountability in business, right? So can you talk us through what B Corp is all about, and how this type of collaboration can impact these business practices, especially the ones that you've just touched on?
Yeah, sure. So B Corp certification is basically a certification or a trust mark that companies can pursue, and it's a very rigorous and lengthy certification process, but essentially companies reach a certain threshold of doing more good or doing less bad across workers, community, customers, planet and governance. And the B Corp movement is about 10 years old. It started in the US, where back then was pretty binary. Either you could be a non-profit or a for-profit organisation. And so it started as a movement of people who were saying the purpose of business should actually be able to be legally to drive benefits to society. And then with that came kind of a movement in the US to develop a legislative framework that supports benefit corporations. And out of that, some of those businesses really wanted to be able to identify themselves as businesses that drive benefit. And so they started to develop this certification process, and the process sort of looks at the business in two ways. It looks at how the business is doing things impactfully. So what is the business performance across these different criteria? But more importantly, I think, how the business is doing impactful things. So what is its purpose? What is its governance? What is its constitution? What is it locked in to the mission of the business to distinguish it from a business that sort of, doesn't have that purpose component? So the other interesting thing about B Corps is they sign up to a declaration of interdependence, which is basically a way of saying, we rely on the planet, we rely on our customers, and we also rely on each other. And what we hear consistently from B Corps is that regardless of how you come to wanting the B, and there's no judgment on the range of reasons why you might pursue that as a business, once you go through the process, it's actually the process that has the value, not the B, not the trust mark. And that's because it's so rigorous that it drives a level of understanding in the business that you don't get unless you pay attention and you set goals for yourself and you decide to change. And so the businesses tend to see really high engagement with staff, really high engagement with customers, and good kind of, relationships. And then they will also tell you that quite often, if you're an export company, for example, the B won't get you the deal with, I don't know, Tesco, but it'll get you the meeting, right? And so there's obviously just standard business benefits as well.
What is the uptake though in Australia and New Zealand?
It's been exponential over the last couple of years. I actually don't know the number at the moment. It's something like 50 in New Zealand. Sorry.
Sorry. Just classic GNOA.
It's actually pretty high, and it's relatively higher in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, than it is in other parts of the world. But it's also, B Lab's a non-profit. It has a really full certification pipeline, and it's quite slow. So for anyone in the room who's thinking about it, if you are thinking about becoming a B Corp, just get the thing in now, and we'll see you in 18 months or so.
Riria, I want to get your kind of thoughts on that, because a lot of what is kind of entrenched in what B Corps are is around the accountability and then the contribution to our society, which is essentially how many of our Māori frameworks actually function and can be applied. Do you see like that similar kind of accountability that is entrenched in the clients in which you're working with?
No, I think we're still kind of stuck in the annual reporting and all of the things that we have to do. But there's, some great examples. Paranini Hiki Wai Tōtara. If you take a look at their annual report, you'll have a look at what they've tried to do. That hasn't been as a result of, standards and the need to disclose forced upon them. It's something that they've done themselves. So I think you're always going to have good examples, but on the whole, we are not there. Having said that, I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, I said to my husband, you guys are the biggest farm, you need to look at whether you go for something like a B Corp certification, because being Indigenous, B Corp certification, exporting, you start to layer on these attributes that might be what helps them to lower the intensity of production, increase the value of production, and that's a positive thing. It's not the end of the game. I see that as a step along the transition, but I do like the philosophy of B Corp. I understand it's quite a rigorous process.
When you talk about, when you say rigorous, like how rigorous are we talking? I'm sure that is what everyone's wondering.
Yeah. So it's complex. It's complex. So there's a 200 possible points in a scoring system, and there's sort of an algorithmic way of assessing companies that they have to get a certain number of points, and then they get basically audited by a standards assessor, who will go in and say, this is or isn't sort of sufficient. So it's rigorous in that you have to put the work in order to get the certification. But I kind of agree, it's not, like even at the global level of the B Corp network, the purpose is to change business, is to change the culture and practice of business, and to change what society expects from business. And so certification is very much a means to achieve that theory of change. It's not the end game, and it's not about businesses. It is to some degree about more businesses becoming B Corps, but it's actually more about just being more like the companies that are really well managed and that really understand their impacts and that are pursuing something purposeful. Right? So the certification is just a means to that end, which is probably where it's more aligned sort of to an Indigenous value set than in the certification itself.
Yeah. John, do you want to weigh in on here? You've written a lot about the need for that kind of the radical transparency for sustainability indicators.
So there's a whole range of new technologies coming on board at the moment. Mostly through new satellite technologies, drone technologies, the development of artificial intelligence as well, means that we're able to much better understand what's happening in terms of, it might be carbon emissions, but they're related to nutrient emissions and other things from our primary industries, which can give us very, very detailed information of what's happening right down to a farm level, like methane sats going up soon. It'll show you the methane coming off farms, that sort of thing. So what it means is that the environmental footprint of different businesses, particularly on the land, whether it's forestry or farming in New Zealand context, will become transparent. And certainly over the next 5 to 10 years, it will most certainly be very transparent, which means that if you've got a poor environmental footprint, it's going to be known. which raises a whole question of entering an area of this radical transparency where people will know the footprint of these businesses, but it has some implications. And I think the first implication is, one is, a positive implication is that you can get feedback constantly on what you're doing and how to improve. I think that's the sort of the positive end. I suppose the negative end is privacy. So there's an issue around privacy and what happens, with your own information and everybody knowing what's going on with a particular organisation. But and what that means to accountability to society more broadly. So interesting area, and I think, but it does fill some of the big data gaps we have currently. It's very, very difficult to assess whether somebody is sustainable from a climate change perspective or not.
Yeah, you've all mentioned data quite prominently. How do we fill that gap? Can we fill that gap?
That's John's question.
I think, I think we're getting there. I mean, I know Ngāi Tahu Farms, there's something like $2.5 million just invested just in monitoring for the farms there. So that's the detailed level of monitoring needed to do that. But not every industry or every farm can afford to do that. But once you start doing it at that level, and then as these new technologies are coming on board over the next few years, I think we will. That data will be available.
Just it'll be too late by then, though.
It depends how things are heading and in what direction. Once you start to get the feedback on how you're operating and getting that constant feedback, then you can identify who those who know how to operate sustainably with low or zero carbon footprints. Others can learn from them. So you get an iterative kind of learning process working between those who know how to operate sustainably and those who are learning, so to speak. So I think it could emerge as a learning network of some sort.
And I just want to remind everyone to put questions on Slido if you haven't yet already. We'll go to those soon. David, I want to come to you, and I know you asked me specifically to ask you about the East Coast Exchange, which I think is actually a good kind of pivot and segue into what we've just kind of addressed. So if you can just tell me a bit about that particular mahi, and especially how to, kind of mobilise a market for that environmental monitoring too,
Yeah, sure. So Toha, its core business really is impact verification, confirming that things have been done in the environment or for climate action, and transferring that data on to those who can use it. And the purpose of it, and I sort of dodged your question about innovation earlier, but it is in that innovation space.
I don't want to be too mean, not on the radio.
But I mean the need for innovation is to overcome particular obstacles, and the obstacle there is that lack of data, that lack of ability to confirm impact and confirm that money and investment has made the difference it was supposed to make. And we do need to know that because if we're just throwing money into things and they're not driving the outcomes that we want, that can be worse than nothing, because it sort of gives a false impression that problems are being addressed and problems are being solved when actually just money's been thrown around for no real good. And so that's part of Toha's mission, is to create that digital infrastructure that can enable the buy side and the sell side to commit to that and to have trust that people are getting what they wanted out of their investments. And the East Coast Exchange, it really emerged out of the crisis of Cyclone Gabriel. Our headquarters is in Tairāwhiti and Gisborne. And I can only really relay the story from the East Coast team out there, but it was really just that night, just knowing that things were going to be incredibly disrupted and unruly. Welfare benefits were due the next day, and the payment system went down, and people started needing to break into dairies and so on. And there was just a sense of fear and looming anarchy because people were in incredibly desperate circumstances.
It was, yeah.
And And so one of the first transactions that they did was to go to orchards, and the supply chains were down, and so people couldn't get their food out of the cold stores into export markets. And isn't this insane that we've got a town here where we don't know if we're going to be getting food in the coming week, and this food is rotting over here, and cannot we just create new novel supply chains which can get that food to where it's needed? And so it built on that and has enabled a number of other different activities, from silk cleanup and repairing fences, getting water infrastructure and water around the region to address those. So it was very much around emergency management, and as part of that, the people who made those contributions received contribution points. And then on the other side of the East Coast Exchange, we've been coordinating with funders who fund into the system, and they can either earmark that money for a particular outcome, or it can go into a general pool and be distributed to points holders. Many people who do that don't claim points. It's essentially they're donating their time or their supplies or equipment. But we realised that many people were going to be out of work. Forests are closed up, and many forest workers in that region and others. And while that kind of voluntary community response to these events is absolutely critical, and you'd never want money to get in the way of that and crowd out that natural human instinct to help one another, it can't be sustained forever, and everybody's got rent to pay and so on. And I know from my experiences, the Canterbury earthquake, there's a exhaustion that comes with that over time. And so this money is starting to go out to the community and to those who contributed. And I was just hearing yesterday, somebody, when they saw that money in their account, just broke down in tears. It was just such a relief, So it's an interesting form of resilience innovation, and we're just trying to scale that up, looking ahead to a nature-based recovery for the region, and delivering on some of those recommendations in the inquiry, and especially how to get money flowing towards regenerative activities and restoration and so on, which currently isn't well served by the markets we have, whether they're the emissions trading scheme as a carbon market or our timber markets, which are the two markets which are driving land use change most predominantly in Tairāwhiti.
I just want to follow on from that, because what we saw, like you say, we saw the community and we saw the people pivot, but what we didn't see pivot was the systems in which we rely on in terms of literally the data, access to internet, the access to our accounts, to the cash machines and all of those sorts of things. And then going off that is we had all of these forestry workers who couldn't do their work, but then we had all these, we needed to build all these temporary housing, we need to do all these other things and fund all of that energy and that resource. But there was so much bureaucracy in the way, and that, as you would have seen, that couldn't happen as fast as it should have happened had those systems kicked into gear. So how do we bring kind of all of the sectors and the agencies, public, private, community, all together in order to have that more kind of, a better response in those particular situations, which we're going to see more of?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question of politics and power at the end of the day. I mean, these institutions are big and fixed and immovable for reasons of integrity in ordinary times, but we're increasingly going into extraordinary times where that immobility becomes more of a potential hazard than a benefit. We're going to need institutions that can move quickly and can adapt and can be driven by needs on the ground. I mean, I think that's something that the East Coast Exchange is really interesting in, that people can come to that exchange with their challenges that they're facing, which cannot be anticipated by policymakers in Wellington. And, if the communications lines are down, they literally don't know, which particular challenges people are facing. And yet, the tendency for institutions in these situations is not to step back and to enable other more agile entities to flourish, but it is to declare a state of emergency and to exert, sovereignty in the classic British Hobbesian sense of the word. That is where the kind of British tradition of the state, which informs the structure of koanatanga, really comes from, that the state is needed to protect people's security in times of challenge. That's its kind of authority, but it's a really clumsy and sort of iron-fisted form of governance. And so I think, this is part of the challenge, is how these institutions can relinquish some power and surrender power in situations like this, especially in order for local authorities, including rangatiratanga, to play a greater role. And that's certainly what we want to do with the East Coast Exchange, as we're in discussions at the moment for that to be co-owned by local institutions and Māori organisations.
Riria, your thoughts on that? I'm just going to grab the computer for us questions. But
I think this is where we get into the communities know themselves best, and you get this inequity, which I feel is matched to the wealth piece, because you've got information and network inequity, and that gives you connections to all the decisions and the resources and all of that sort of thing. Now, if you have a look at I think it was the Hawke's Bay, and you had a look who got help first. It was those who were probably perceived to be wealth generators. Who got help second? Probably those perceived to be community wealth generators. So that privileged access to network and information, I think, has a big impact on what and how communities can respond. But if you even go further into the adaptation space, the dynamism that we're talking about, the ability to adapt that we talk about, that's almost like the complete opposite of what we have. And so we've just got to find that mechanism that enables, or sort of, it's like you can unhitch the wagon from the structure in those times that you need. And so that's almost like a transition point that hopefully as our governments can be comfortable with, so that our communities can, they know their coastline, they know their rivers, they know everything. Like, there's nothing anybody else can tell them about themselves. So I think we just need to try and think about how that bias and the blind spots in decision making. We can't expect people in decision making to make decisions around things they've never experienced. Yet they do it every day.
Yes, they do.
And so let's figure that piece out.
Yeah. Some awesome questions coming through from the audience. Joe, I'll start with you. This, which I'm assuming this one's for you. How can we reconcile the need for degrowth to mitigation emissions with the need to finance adaptation measures?
I don't know. I mean, it's really hard, right? Like, ongoing question. I suppose we need to. How am I gonna answer this? I guess from the position that I have, some of the key messages that we hear every day is that there's plenty of money to get this stuff done. There's plenty of international capital looking for climate solutions. It's tended to be focused on mitigation, and now there is sort of an emerging focus on adaptation, but there's literally trillions of dollars of international capital looking for opportunities to invest in things that are green or sustainable. I mean, that's the promise of sustainable finance. It doesn't answer degrowth. And to be honest with you, at the centre, we're not trying to answer that right now. I guess these things have to play out over different timescales. One thing I did want to say about how do we kind of advance adaptation funding and financing, it would be really good to have a plan. So we don't have a plan. We have an emissions reduction plan. We have a national adaptation plan. They have funding and financing sections in them, which are very thoughtful kind of, pieces of work undertaken by some of the people in this room who spend all of their time thinking about how we're going to get this done. But we actually don't have a coordinated government-led strategy that says these are the investment priorities. This is what businesses can rely on. This is the policy certainty that we're going to provide for you. And so you can invest here with some level of confidence and certainty, and you can make investment decisions over a long run because we have a plan, we're going to stick to the plan. That's part of what we need, and how we develop that plan in a way that, you know, reflects the best of all facets of society. I mean, that's tricky. But certainly that's part of the reason organisations like the Centre, and there's another centre now for with the focus on agricultural emissions, like there are these initiatives popping up everywhere that exist to kind of facilitate those processes. So there's cause for optimism. And I also can't get off of this panel without acknowledging Alex White, who's sitting in the front here, who has, has pretty significant responsibilities on this matter of funding and financing from a government perspective. Plenty of people working on it really hard, but it's tricky, and there does need to be some high-level leadership and coordination.
John, a question here, or anyone can take it, but John, adaptive planning takes time, especially for infrastructure. How can we better articulate the value of that planning time?
Well, I think the first thing is, I think we need to articulate the difference between grey infrastructure and blue and green infrastructure within our landscapes. We need to, channel investment into the blue-green infrastructure and design alongside grey, because they can work in synergy. Then in terms of time frame for that, we need excellent planning tools, whole of landscape planning tools that can show us where we can, for example, if we're talking about ecosystem reconstruction, where we should be reconstructing or restoring ecosystems, and the impact that will have on things like, say, extreme flood events or drought events, where wetlands should be placed and so forth. So, long horizon planning, 100-year timeframes, a minimum of 100-year timeframes of thinking, also factoring, of course, climate shifting as different degree warming scenarios. I think a lot of the information's already sitting there, a lot of the frameworks and tools are already sitting there. It's a matter of, pulling on some of the research that so many people in this room have done, the excellent models that are already sitting out there. But we do need some sort of broader integrated data approach, planning approach with those sort of long-term timeframes. And I do think, certainly iwi, Māori and Māori, all scale, marae scale too, they're thinking in those sort of long-term frames. And so I would be looking at how that thinking can flow up through into those approaches.
Absolutely. For Riria and probably David, Cyclone Gabrielle is estimated to cost New Zealand $14 billion, and around $1 billion of this is covered by insurance. Is there too much emphasis on insurance and climate adaptation? We haven't touched this, but I'm kind of keen to touch on it.
I think insurance is a really important part of the scheme, so I wouldn't want to say there's too much. It might just be that there's not enough on everything else.
Very good answer.
I think one of the key things, I think, is the inclusiveness of insurance and the extent to which people are able to get it. It's well known that Māori have less coverage than Pākehā and others, and that leaves them more, statistically more vulnerable to these events without that immediate recourse to, finance after the event. And so I think, I kind of defer to Belinda wherever you are here on these issues. Insurance is incredibly complicated. I think it can play a role, but there's all sorts of risks of perverse impacts as well. And so it's really just it's something which was interesting in a discussion that me and Joe were in on Friday, was the role that perhaps micro-insurance might play, especially for targeting more vulnerable communities who don't have access to insurance. And there are countries exploring this publicly funded microinsurance schemes that can be triggered by a particular event, such as a cyclone and so on, and it gives a no questions asked payout to those or those individuals, and that can make potentially a real big difference for people in the immediate event, and it's money that could be used in a number of different ways and doesn't leave them hanging on for waiting for their indemnity claim to be finished, which is a emerging issue in Auckland as well as Tairāwhiti and the Hawke's Bay, and certainly something I remember from the Canterbury earthquakes as well as a real source of agony for people. So to your point around innovation, there is potentially some opportunities there to explore innovation in the insurance sector to drive different sorts of outcomes.
If we look also at the social resilience, so part the insurance conversation for a moment, but you look at the marae everywhere that, they become the hubs, but there's actually not a lot of support for the role and function that they play at those really critical times. That, and so, if we think about that, we start to think about this kind of funding, how does that make its way towards these places that actually care for people, whether they've got insurance or not, is what I'll add to that.
Just on here, a couple more before we wrap up. But is there a tension between communities knowing what they need to adapt with the finance available and the potential maladaptive, have I said that right? Maladaptive outcomes, for example, seawalls? John, maybe? Or...
I can
go, Joe.
Before we get it started.
Yeah.
Yes. So specifically on the issue of data, banks and insurers and the government have information about which assets and properties are currently at higher or lower risk. And we, to some degree, as consumers and homeowners, will start to get that information. It's in the Who Reads the Lim report. But there is absolutely a tension between the availability of the information, the comparability, consistency and utility of that information, and then who can get the information. And so this is a really core kind of equity conversation that needs to be had, because this information will be used to price risk, and that will have an impact on the value of our assets, and that conversation needs to include the people who are going to be exposed to the change in the value of the assets. So there's absolutely a conversation that needs to be had, and it's a fundamentally important conversation that is becoming more and more urgent every day, because if you want to incentivize adaptation through different financial incentives, approaches, let's say, then you need to make sure that you're incentivizing the right things, and that information isn't held by a select few organisations or individuals who may have undue influence over the outcomes. Yeah. Inadvertently, maybe, but nonetheless.
I'd just add as well, purely from the finance perspective, when we're looking at private capital supporting adaptation infrastructure, by far the biggest obstacle that's identified in all the research here and internationally is the fact that there's just a lack of bankable, investable projects, and that reflects the fact that there's very limited or no revenue flows from the adaptation assets which are created, and that's just a really challenging fact about climate adaptation and mitigation. There's lots of money-making opportunities in renewable energy and other sorts of climate technology, but in adaptation, often the primary purpose is to reduce loss and damages. It's not supposed to turn around a profitable return, and so that really does raise questions around that is why public funding is so unavoidable in this space, and I think why a lot more work needs to be done to find ways to get private finance in there, and there are emerging conversations around blended finance and so on, and using public money to catalyse that private investment by adjusting the risk and return expectations. And also something I wrote about in my report as well was that if private businesses and organisations are going to be beneficiaries of that adaptation infrastructure, then rather than the costs purely being socialised, they should pay into the costs of that infrastructure through value capture mechanisms like targeted rates and other sorts of mechanisms like that.
A good follow-up question that's on here as well is how can we balance though that short-term cost and balance short-term cost to long-term benefit? For example, obviously the current investment into fund an electrified New Zealand. Who wants to take that one?
It's time, eh?
Yeah.
Look at our lending horizons are very short term, like short term by my Māori standard. But you go into sort of other countries and they've got intergenerational lending. When you can extend the time over which you're borrowing money, your affordability to service that is much better. So for some reason we're stuck on a much shorter time frame. And we've been in an environment where we can justify that, but perhaps now it's time to look at something else.
Discount rates are crucial to that as well. I mean, the government uses a pretty high, flat 5% discount rate on everything, and even in the private sector, I've talked to institutional investors about forestry and tried to get them shift their discount rates on forestry systems which are more resilient than others, and that should be reflected in the discount rate, but it's not. And so, we're going to have those conversations around adjusting that too, I think.
There's a few questions about B Corps. And it is a side issue, but like there's quite a lot of it. There's quite a few parts of it. People love the B, it seems. But there's one question around whether or not it aligns, does B Corp membership align with the Climate Leaders Coalition?
The New Zealand Climate Leaders Coalition.
I'm assuming, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the big picture answer to that is B Corp is currently going through a refresh of its standards globally. So it's a global standard, and David's on the advisory committee for that, so probably knows more about it than I do. But globally, there's an emergence of a lot of different standards and regimes. There are taxonomies, there's disclosure standards like what we have here. There are kind of international sustainability frameworks that companies are using, and so B Corp, in order to maintain its position as sort of the front of the pack, is having to rethink about its standards. And so I would assume, I think the Climate Leaders Coalition pledge is, pledging to 1.5 degrees alignment, and certainly that's what the B Corp standard would be looking at, kind of global best practice around science, science carbon.
In terms, going from B Corps to B Corps, such as iwi and marae. So iwi and marae have been at the forefront, obviously, of our major disasters, and this has been something that has been raised quite often today, and for good reason. And we saw, COVID was actually, was a prime example of how we saw that kick into gear at the scale in which it did. So what funding or priority of funding is going into them? We see kind of funding drops here and there, but it's not consistent, nor is it long term.
Agree.
Agree, come on. But I think on that, especially around the work that Toha does, is that how do we ensure that our iwi and our marae and our hapu and our runanga are becoming self-sustainable enough that they don't have to rely on the Crown and on public funding in order to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, marae were the first organisation which engaged with the East Coast Exchange was the marae, and I think that just goes to show how engaged they are in this space and what an absolutely critical role they play for what we otherwise know as civil defence, and they should absolutely be funded properly for providing that service, and manaakitanga shouldn't be purely exploited in that regard. If the East Coast Exchange can help that, then that's great, but I think there'd be a number of different ways to support that funding, absolutely.
I know we've gone over time as per the program, but I thought you guys, it's only been an hour since lunch, I'm sure you guys are surviving. But in order to wrap us up, I do want to come to each of the panellists to ask, and this is what I did with the previous panel around, what do you want people to take away from today, from your corridor, or potentially a particular project or area you personally want to see be funded or to see happen in order to address what we are talking about today. I will start with you, David.
I think something that's been on my mind is just expressing humility in regards to the uncertainty that's ahead. I think we do keep coming back to data as though it might be, it might fill that gap that uncertainty leaves us with, but that's just never going to happen. The kinds of changes which are ahead are so complex and, incredibly complex systems interconnecting and influencing one another. There's just, there's a huge amount of uncertainty and, a lot of our conversation today has been about the costs and so on. There's a danger in presenting too much certainty in regards to that, and I think, that recent fiscal assessment by Treasury, I think that was, perhaps its biggest fault was that it presented, numbers as if there was some certainty around the future costs, and I just don't think that that's true at all, and that speaks as somebody who was contributing to some of the, research which underpinned that. I mean, yeah. I think. And maybe it's the scientists' fault as well, and that more should be done to communicate that uncertainty to policymakers so that they don't come away thinking that there are clear answers in this.
Okay, Riria?
I think one of the first things we try to innovate our way out of the problems that we've created using the same set of thinking that created the problem in the first place. So we keep going around in a bit of a vortex. I think what I'd like to pose to us is a question more to sort of catalyse thinking than anything else, and that was if Aotearoa lost 90%, if Aotearoa could only produce enough food for our own consumption and the rest couldn't go anywhere else, what would our economy look like if we didn't rely on Papatūānuku? And if we can do that, we might stop trying to figure out the things around the bottom and start trying to figure out what's up here.
Kia ora. John, kei a koe.
I think for me, the takeaway is there's a lot of solutions out there. People operating in different areas, different sectors, different examples in communities, different examples in government, regional councils and ministries of incredible things happening. I think the solutions are already sitting there for the most case. It's a matter of those pinpointing where those are and letting them lead. And I think networks of those groups is what will create the new institutions for a new way of operating. So I think that would be my takeaway. And in terms of something I would like to see happen, that would probably be what I was referring to before about the ability to plan across the country on a whole of landscape scale of how we adapt and change.
Kia ora, John. Joe, kei a koe.
Yeah, I guess it's really important to pull together. So obviously we need sort of bipartisan support for, and some certainty around the general direction of travel. But I also think adaptation versus mitigation is an unhelpful kind of framing. Bread and butter versus climate change, inflation versus climate action, all those things. Like it's a both and on all counts. And I just think there's this sort of these sort of corrosive narratives that take hold, and they just they corrode, I guess. So my final thought would be now is absolutely a time to respond in a considered way and to try to create cohesion, pull together and try to all move with each other in the same direction. Don't know what that direction is, because we have not yet defined what is sustainable or what is adaptation or what is resilience, but we're just heading in that direction.
I didn't ask you guys' trees. So you guys went here for the morning, eh? So you had to introduce yourself. So just to wrap us up and get people to connect with their trees, as we're all about tāne today. David, what was your tree and why?
Pūtea. I've got a reforestation project with Ngāti Whātua Rākei up at Orake, and we planted the trees in 2019, 2020, and the pūtea had the best survival rates through the droughts, and they also bring in the birds, which get the natural regeneration processes going. So.
It's very on brand, David.
Yeah.
Riria, if you were, the pātai was, if you were a tree, what tree would you be and why?
Did it have to be a native?
Oh, controversial.
I'm totally nectarine because I love nectarines.
So practical, love it. John, what was yours?
Well, I live near Riccarton Bush in Aotearoa, Christchurch, which is like the last little remnant area of forest that used to exist all across the plains, and they've got some old stand kahikatea there, so that would be mine.
Oh, beautiful. Jai.
I mean, I think I've watched my mother mow her lawns for thousands and thousands of hours. So I'm not going to be a tree. I'm going to be some flax. And I'm going to just be like a replanted lawn that doesn't need mowing anymore. That would be mine. That would be me.
The woman's answers are really practical. And our tāne, we're very deep and very on brand with tāne. So ka pai. If we could please give a round of applause to our amazing speakers. Kia ora. Thank you so much, you fellas. You guys, if you just go, Phil's got something for you there. Kia ora.